Emily, thank you so much for all of the excellent speakers. So welcome. Yeah, welcome. Okay. So I think that today there must be some many students who want to ask or consult some questions for you. And the first question is about the cooperation. Yeah, we know that Apache has much experience cooperated with some other communities. So do you think there exists some norms or rules or some other important tips when cooperated to other communities? Yeah.
So, oh, is that working? Okay. One of the important parts that we've mentioned before with Apache is that when we work with organizations, whether it's Microsoft or many others, it's important that we work as individuals. When we mentioned part of that is one of the important roles foundations like Apache play is as a what we would call in English a even playing field. So all of the people who cooperate at Apache know that we can cooperate as peers without necessarily strong other agendas. The goal there, as was mentioned yesterday in a lot of Brett's talk, was around having strong community-led development that focuses on the long-term advantages of the software. We do collaborate with lots of companies, some of them through sponsors, but we prefer to treat and collaborate with people as individuals.
I will also say that we're learning a lot in the new world of open source development. And I think that for some of our engineers who are used to be able to resolve issues within a team environment, now working in the open environment, and when they have to go get an employee of another company to take a look of their contribution, and with no other recourse, actually has been proving a bit of a challenging situation. So one example we had is that we had a particular pull request, I think, to Chromium. And we just simply couldn't get a Google engineer to look at it for whatever reason. And we eventually succeeded because we had a fantastic relationship with the Clan team, who also has a strong Google contributor. So we got that guy to go poke the other guy on the Chromium side to eventually get our contribution in. So it kind of really showed us the importance of having a community and actually having a team collaborating. And I think that, we look at it as a lesson learned, is to say, well, when we are the core committers of a repo, how do we not do those things? Yeah. How can we be more responsive?
Does this work? Yeah. I just want to add to that corporations in general have a problem with the relatively slow speed of development in communities. When you're working on a project within a company, you have speedy responses. If there's something, you just lean over the desk and ask the guy next to you, how should we do this? And you are on your way within minutes. Whereas on a community-led development, that can take days. And you must be able to work on many things in parallel when you work on a community-based project versus when you're working on a corporate-driven internal project.
I just want to add one more interesting thing we observed, is that we're still learning and we don't know what the best way to deal with this is. We, for example, just observed in the Node.js community, there was a strong disagreement on a particular issue.
Never happens.
So then the community decided to split. And honestly, as a sort of a key contributor to that, we were a little bit caught off guard. So we're not, as a corporation, within the corporation, we obviously have ways to go resolve such a conflict. But in the open source community, we're like, what? What do we do? Yeah, so we're trying to sort it out. Yeah.
Thank you. And the second question is about the open source strategy. So do you think that what is the difference of open source strategy between the big companies and the startups? Do you have some suggestions to them?
I guess I am on the hook here because I work for one of the biggest companies in the world, as well as being an entrepreneur and have several startups in the oven at the same time. It's really difficult to get big corporations to embrace being a contributor to open source. I have worked for 3 major corporations that you all know of, and they are very hesitant to release anything. And it's not so much about they're afraid of the IP itself. Everybody realizes without the full context and all the back-end resources available, it's not a competitive disadvantage to release that open source. What they really worry about is the reputation that we don't write good code here. It's all about, especially when you're talking banks. They don't want to be scrutinized that say, oh, that's bad code. Look how insecure this is, or if this code is this bad, how about my bank account, right? For startups, it's a lot about worrying about what the VC is going to say when everything you actually have is available to everybody else. And therefore, VC-driven startups have a problem to release a lot of things in open source because of intellectual property is considered valuable and not necessarily the idea or the service itself.
Oh, what I find, so particularly the difference for strategy for startups and corporations, there definitely are some differences in terms of philosophy approach to it. For corporations, one of the biggest advantages of open source or having a strategy on open source is often around recruiting. You do send a strong message when you release something open source that we are a serious engineering organization. When you can look at someone's code and whether it's misspellings or something else, but you can see that what kind of engineering organization, what kind of engineering culture, and that helps with recruiting. So a lot of large corporations are focused around their engineering brand when they're dealing with open source. For startups, open source is an even more important competitive advantage, either by not releasing it necessarily, or by taking advantage of open source to accelerate your development. It can also be a useful way early on to get some key hires when you're starting in an open source community, or to take advantage of collaborations, because again, you don't have a lot of resources at a startup, so sometimes being able to open source things gives you a chance to solicit more contributions. But you're at different kinds of needs, and typically for the larger corporations, a lot of it is around engineering brand.
I very much agree. Let me add a few things. One is that for startups, what we see a lot is that for startups, it's really the idea that wins. It's the speed to test and realize your ideas. And implementation will constantly change. And the implementation you pick when you're starting, when you have 100,000 users will be very different than the implementation you will pick when you have 1 million users. It will continuously change. And for startup, one of the most valuable things they pick is what they think about as open source software that has been hardened, meaning that it came from a company that has scaled. So if something comes from like Yammer or Facebook or etc., they're like, oh, or Netflix, they say, I can trust this thing because this has scaled. So they will just take a bet on it. We see that a lot. For enterprise, I think that, I wouldn't say it's principle. I think that the risk profile is fundamentally different. No startup worries about their CFO going to jail. I can tell you it's the top concerns of many of Fortune 500 is that if you use software that is actually a problem, that's why US and a lot of the big institutions worldwide has a lot of compliance. That's a word you never hear a startup, compliance requirement. That's actually when the CFO can go to jail. And so they're very careful about what things they can pick and truly understand the risk profile behind your technology selections. So a lot of time that the reason they may or may not go after particular open source is that their business is the bank. Their business is not in this piece of software. So if they don't have way to kind of maintain the software for long run, they don't know what to do with it. So, so one of the things that for any enterprise software vendors like Microsoft or HP, IBM, we provide 10-year support. And that is actually very important. And so, so we are, if an open source company just out there and it's good for the company, for enterprise to use it, but if the talent may not be there, then what do you do when you have issues and bugs? Who do you call, right, when that issue arises? So the risk profile of these companies or consideration are significantly different. And as I mentioned earlier for Microsoft, the different businesses in Microsoft depend on what business they are in. I will tell you Windows is the most conservative. And for good reason. Because they have a big target painted on their forehead. They have been sued so many times. So it's those sort of different considerations.
Well, one last follow-up on that. When we talk about risk profiles, that's one of the important things about an organization like Apache. So yes, sometimes the Apache Software Foundation, we may not move as rapidly as a small, nimble, 1 or 2 man project on GitHub, right? There's sometimes reasonable criticism about Apache, about our velocity or our ability to innovate. Nevertheless, we see over decades now of continual progress and continual contributions in open source. And largely that's because an organization like Apache helps particularly with the risk profile for organizations, whether it's Microsoft or Google or any of the other large companies, is to provide some degree of oversight and compliance. That's not sometimes the funnest thing. That's not what a lot of us who start in Apache really want to work on, is going through and doing license compliance reviews on some incubator project. But there's an incredible value to the broader community when we do that. So yes, when we look at the incubator, there's sometimes a lot of overhead at times, but it provides a valuable service to the community so we can collaborate with organizations like Microsoft.
I just want to say one thing, short. I am not allowed to ask a question on an open source mailing list with my corporate mail account due to risk profile you mentioned about what are we liable. If I want to do that, I have to send it to public communications first for them to approve it, and then I can send it out.
Thank you. The third question is about the 2 sentences. I think the first sentence is about that community over code. Yeah. Just like the Apache's slogan, community-led development. And the second sentence is about something like, oh, stop talking, just show me your code. So how do you think about the 2 sentences? What do you think the philosophy of open source governance?
One of the early strong personalities in Apache back in the 90s once said that only the combination of bad code and great vision will succeed as an open source project. Because if you have good code, nobody have an urge to fix it. And vice versa, if the community doesn't see the vision, they will fall apart. So you need the community, and you need code that is not too good.
I'd also add that would you use an open source project if there's no community around it, right? If you just happen to be searching somewhere and you find a repository, you find some code, yes, it's got a license, but no one's touched it, no one talks about it, there's no email list, there's no one that you can ask, would you trust to use it? And the answer for most people, and definitely for larger organizations, is no. Because the trust that we have in the code isn't so much about the lines of code and the bits and the bytes, it's about the people involved in it. What keeps code relevant over time is the community. In fact, as we see open source projects within Apache go into the attic, it's not because the code isn't relevant, it's because the community has moved on. So what keeps open source and what keeps technology valuable is that we have humans who are using it, and humans who shepherd it, humans who care for it. So that's why we emphasize, and sometimes it's a real challenge to say, look, we actually want lots of people using this code, not just you. We want lots of different companies using this code, not just the one sponsor. Because we know that that ensures a longevity around that code base. The code itself may not actually be the fastest or most effective at that time, but over time, through the future, it will continue to improve because of the people involved. So it's taking a long-term vision is what we're trying to describe in that idea.
Yeah, and I think that as you mentioned about the VC, yes. So the next question is about the venture capital. We all know that China has come to the age of entrepreneurship times, and in China we call something like 大众创新, 万众创业, something like that. So we know that open source doesn't represent the totally free. So if for you, how to convince venture capital to invest and support open source?
You can't. I have tried, I have failed, I don't know, I don't have an answer.
I think it depends partly, though, on the kind of strategy you're taking as a startup, right?
I think it matters what you are offering. I have been mostly in product development where the product is the software and not necessarily the experience. I mean, League of Legends is an experience. You could release all the software as open source and nobody would be able to use it to compete with you, right?
Well, and I think, again, some of it is if we're using open source, I would actually hope that most VCs would challenge startups saying, well, all this source code is available for you to get started. Why aren't you using it? Now, if I'm doing a startup where my focus is a product where I'm releasing it as open source and I'm doing services around it, there are some realistic challenges in that space. It can be done. We've seen many companies who do it, but there are challenges mostly at scale. Because your scale factor there is largely around your ability to support. What we do see is, and this goes a lot to the strategy or the licenses that we use, is a couple of approaches that startups can have. One is they can use it to be very disruptive in a market, right? So if there's a market that just has a lot of entrenched players, sometimes you can use open source to challenge that marketplace. Another is that you can use open source as a way to again, develop a certain kind of user base that you want to move forward with. So I think it really depends on what this realistic company goal and strategy is that you're using it for.
Yeah, I have seen some interesting examples in this regard. I think that being open source actually helps with initial adoption of the technology significantly. So if you think about, sometimes I think about open source as the new free trial and then sort of like the fastest way to get user adoption. And once you have the user base grown up, then you can kind of ask yourself whether services or tooling around your services as ways you can actually monetize for startup companies. Actually, a very interesting example of this is actually Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch actually, for people who probably a lot of you have heard of it, they actually become a very fast spread in enterprises, and they got a lot of users, and the software itself is pretty good, but it still has issues, and so they provide servicing, and then they also provide a tools layer around it, and that's actually the thing they sell and monetize. So that become a pretty compelling play for VCs. So it's not, so if you think about, you open source, everything do things for a reason. You don't open source for open source sake. It's really, I think that's a great adoption vehicle, and then that's probably one way to think about it.
Yeah, it tends to work more in the middleware layer. We had like Cloudera, we have all the cloud companies that have done that. I mentioned in my talk that we use, at Riot Games, we use a very large React cluster, one of the largest in the world. React has a community edition that's open source, but we do pay for commercial support in it. And so there is that model. Again, the challenge from having a startup background, the challenge for a startup is, as always, is how do you scale, right? So that's something you have to think about is, and really think about something not everyone likes to think about is the open source license that you're using and how that plays into your business model.
Actually, let me just, since I was talking about, I was talking about Elasticsearch, and then people were asking, for actually Elasticsearch right now is in one of the services we offer today is called Application Insight from Azure and Visual Studio, and actually one of the key technology we use underneath is Elasticsearch. And we actually do buy, commercial support. But, we see, for something to scale, for Microsoft scale, we actually found it very challenging to have something of, Elasticsearch, because when we run issues, when our engineer don't have the expertise, we couldn't really recover and mitigate issues in minutes. And it's just become a constant struggle of what do we do. There was another one we used to use, Kafka, which is another Apache. And so that was a very good sort of a technology to get started. It was super fast, but once we reached a particular scale, we kind of realized we had to go rewrite it ourselves to really hit the kind of a mega scale that we were looking at. And we also realized that we were able to eventually produce better tech in the particular domain that we're focusing it on. So I think that, again, no technology is sacred. It's all about, does it fit your need? Does it actually make you more successful or not? And then you should constantly evaluate whether this fits if you fit your needs in your last sort of level, and when you scale to the next level, it may or may not continue to fit your need. So it's evolving.
Thank you. And I think that the next question is about the diversity in open source field. Yeah. I think more and more people are paying much attention to the topic about women and open source. So we can see that women has become a large part of participants in open source. So how do you think of the relationship between women and open source? Could you please give us some suggestions to us ladies to participate open source?
This is always one of the hardest questions. So the reason I sigh is because, I think it's no secret that women in IT overall is challenged. And it's not about women in open source. It's really about women in the IT industry. It's a very challenged place. And the challenges in different geos, I will actually tell you, is also very different. I would say that in the US, the challenge is that there aren't enough people graduating from college with technology, with they call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math kind of background. And a lot of it has to do with, I would say that in the elementary and in the high school, in the U.S. education system, it's okay to be not very good at math, which is unimaginable in China, I know. And which is that, like you hear parents tell their girls, they're like, oh, you don't like math, it's okay. But I know that is completely impossible here. If your math is not good, 你高考肯定是不会过的。So I think that this is actually, it's very helpful in China because you actually have a lot of girls entering into science and technology field because of math is a requirement, it's as an expectation that you will do well. At the same time, I think that I would say that China, in terms of sort of the gender equality, a lot of the equality issues is not as where the US is. The fact that every single resume, when I first moved to Shanghai in 2009, I was shocked. Every resume came with birthdays and pictures. I'm like, wow. Like, I just wasn't used to that, right? And and I remember when we started the our Shanghai Global Development Center around 2005, 2006, I had women engineers in there tell me, which is not that long ago, it's only 8-9 years ago. I had women engineers come and tell me, they said their guys in the team asked them, why are you in this job? like this is not a job for girls. Like, why are you in this job? This kind of question cannot be tolerated in the U.S. Like that just no one can ask that kind of question. But unfortunately in China, that is not the case. And I think that what I really want to encourage is that whether it's IT or open source, is that the fundamental belief that just like you can make it through Gaokao, you can make it. You're good at it. You can shine, and just have that confidence and belief in yourself.
Yeah, this is very good, and it is a very complex subject. One thing I do want to say, for those of us who are men in this field, you may not have said that. You may never have said anything that offensive, right? I think many of us would agree that we want a very diverse and open community. But it will not be open and diverse until each of us individually take responsibility to invite more people into this community. And we have to do that individually. I may not feel responsible, I may not be directly responsible for certain actions, but I have to take responsibility for the community. as part of who I am. And until each of us feel that, it will not change. So that, I think, is a challenge. We say in open source anyone is welcome. We say it doesn't matter who you are, what skin color it is, what language you speak, where it is in the world that you come from, what college you graduated. But that won't be true until each of us, as individuals, those of us in this community, actively encourage and create a welcoming environment. It will take active effort on our part. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's not enough to just simply say, you know, why don't you go to school? Why don't we have more women in universities? It's up to the women to make the change. It is not just up for the women to make the change. It is absolutely up for the men to create a more welcoming environment.
Well said. We are all guilty in the open source community. Some communities are worse than others, and none of them are really good. Because you spoke about the percentage between women and men in STEM field in general, but even with those numbers, they don't translate down to open source communities, most of them. There are some exceptions where the participation of women matches or closely matches the STEM field graduation numbers. And why is that? It's hard to know. It could be cultural, could be from childhood and all of these things. But I think a large degree is that the competitive nature in open source, people who are drawn into open source are typically quite competitive and want to learn more and excel and show that I can do as good as the next guy. And that creates a little bit of an environment where women may feel it's too harsh for them. I'm not sure. I can't back it up with science, but that's what I've been speculating about.
I completely agree with Aaron's comments. I have certainly, as I browse through some of the community kind of comments, you can certainly tell that certain community has a much more hostile tone, just the tone they use in commenting on each other's work, versus a more welcoming and educational and helpful tone. And that can make a world of difference in what tone you choose to use in the replies and co-reviews and the comments you write. And I think it's fundamentally about taking responsibility, being welcoming and being open and being gentle and helpful versus the I'm smarter than anyone else. And I think that is actually very important.
And since you actually spoke about the diversity, there is many axes of diversity, and this tone, this hostility that can be perceived, whether it's real or not, also affects which cultures are easily adopting to this style. Eastern culture has traditionally been more show face, be kind, be gentle, rather than the American, I'm the best, I'm the greatest. And this is shown in the open source communities, shines through, and we who on the inside, we need to take active steps to get better at it, definitely. Yes. You can take this one, I don't need it.
Well, hi, I'm a volunteer of this meeting, and I'm from the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences. Well, as you said, the perfect code is not that required in the open source community. And well, I mean, you may heard that the engineer interview is broken. Recently, you may heard that the guy who made Brew, which is a package management system in a Mac, the guy was rejected by Google or Facebook. Yeah, and he was asked to write a binary tree, and he totally had no idea about that. So, I mean, in this room, there are too many guys, engineers from too many companies, and students of UCAS. So I want to say, he may be the interviewer. So I want to say, if you are the interviewer of the, a company or the open source engineer communities, so what do you really want from the interviewee?
Are we talking about the job interview?
Well, I just want to ask.
Are you talking about getting a job at the company? Is that?
Open source. Will the companies come to here? They have their open source project and want them widely used. So
The question with the binary trees and all of that is interesting because most traditional software developing countries that doesn't produce software products necessarily, like banks, they are emphasizing on this far too much. If you don't know how to implement a hash map out of memory in 3 minutes on a whiteboard, you might be rejected by some guy who thinks that is the most important thing you can do.
Microsoft might be responsible for this from 20 years ago.
And at the same time, I read a report from Google relatively recently that they have researched what are the indicators before interview, at interview, whether these individuals will succeed and be above average contributed within Google itself. And the conclusion was basically, there is no indicators. It doesn't matter of your education, your background, your experience, whether you are good at algorithms or not. It seems they don't have, they can't define what makes a good mark for a hire. So for them, it's still quite random. And they can back it up with statistics. So go try to find that.
I actually wasn't joking because I think Microsoft was famous from 20, 30 years ago that the Microsoft college interview was famous for the basic for computer science algorithms, and myself went through that. I think that, for any interview, I mean, in particular for, college campus people, campus students that we interview, the fundamental thing we really look for is a couple of things. Whether the person is, there's fundamental qualities like integrity, is the person honest? Is that, those are just sort of, kind of goes with, that's like a must-have pile. And then I think we fundamentally look for problem-solving skills. And so, one of the beliefs that we have is that what you know today is very rapidly going to be irrelevant. It's your ability to learn. That's more important. So we look for problem-solving skills. We'll look for ability to learn, and that sort of innate curiosity. And then we think that's very important.
Passion.
Passion. Well, let me come back to passion. I'll give you 1 second on that. I have a soap opera on passion. And then we look for being a team player, because unlike in school, you're assigned an individual project exam. At work, you're always working with a team to produce things together. So the ability to work with team, sort of how did you do during school projects, and what role did you play, and how well you collaborated. Those are super, important. And we also look for cultural fit. We look for whether people will fit into the Microsoft culture or not. And those are some of the more fundamental things. And I think I completely agree that it's very difficult to tell whether someone, I think our odds of telling that someone's going to be a good superstar versus just okay is wildly off when people come join us. But those are some fundamental things we look for. And coming to the passion point is that we have learned, I would say I have learned, and also I know I coach my team to be very careful about passion, because to the cultural point, how the people from different cultural backgrounds express passion is super different. You will have some people who are jumping in the bed, they're very, very excited. But then there are people who are actually really excited, but you can't really tell from their facial expression. I have also seen many, many of those. So in general, we actually use the indicator of most of the people we make offer to have multiple offers. I mean, the people we know we want to hire the best. And in that case, that the fact they choose to join Microsoft, I would like to take that as indication of their interest in what we're doing. They're excited about what we have to offer, and the way they verbalize what excites them, what's interesting, kind of matches how we think about it. So that's sort of that's how we think about it.
We hire 50 people a year in Shanghai, and we get around 6,000 applications. A little bit more than half of that get rejected on skills in English, because we have that as a primary requirement. It's more important than computer science background. Out of those 3,000 remaining that get placed in front of all the vice presidents in the Shanghai office to sift through and pull out about 150. So you have to reject 19 out of 20. And since it's all out of university, what do you look for in those pieces of paper? They're all the same. They have the same template, or there's a dozen of them, but it's almost impossible to pick out it. And personally, I look for open source contributions and exactly what kind of project they do on their final project in university, because that says a lot about what are their interests and how does that fit into our environment.
Real quickly, I'm very familiar with the example you brought up with the homebrew example at Google. There are some things we can't necessarily know about how all that interview went. I do agree that, as has been mentioned, the interview process is more of an art than a science. There's a lot that we're still learning as an industry on how to best measure talent. I do a lot of interviews. It's one of my primary roles at Riot. One thing I can say is to reemphasize what was said here again is there are a lot of skill sets outside of just engineering that are important. So yes, a core in computer science is critical. It says something about how one cares about their craft, that they do care about maybe a hash map or about a binary tree. But that's not the only dimension that we look for. I want to work with a full human. I want to work with someone who can communicate, who has interests and passions. At Riot, one thing that's important for us is that they are gamers. They may or may not play League of Legends a lot, but they are gamers. You mentioned that the interest in Microsoft and the culture fit there. That is also usually a very critical point. So I think one thing that is critical, and as mentioned, I will definitely look for open source contributions. And the point that I will make here is I would rather see a single bug fix or a single commit on a larger open source project, right? Some of the projects we've mentioned at Apache or other well-known open source projects, than an entire little project you did that's just you and your friend on GitHub. It's not that that isn't valuable, that can be great work, but showing that you can learn how to collaborate and get a commit and a pull request all the way through that process and understand a complex bit of software says significantly more about your ability to be a software engineer than being able to post up a simple project that you did on your own. So when I emphasized before that as a student, your contributions into open source can be an incredible way to build your career. It is true. It says a lot about who you are. And it will also, the secondary effect of that is one of the things I didn't understand about open source beginning was just how much the community is important. You build a global professional network when you start to work in the open source community. And that can help you no matter where you are.
Yes, very helpful. So we think we still welcome one more question.
The last one.
Thanks, everyone. I'm a student from Peking University. I have two situations about open source software development and how I can play as I'm a junior student. And considering as a student, I always write projects for research, for papers. But we know open source software or community, the maintenance is a long-term work, and after I write the paper, maybe the project will finish it, and no one will maintain this work. So how can I publish this work to the communities? And it will cost me a lot of time, so I think I can afford this time. So I think this is the gap between the open source and my research. So how can I balance these times? And also, if I graduate, I come to an office or I come to a job, then I will have a lot of work in my companies. And how can I balance my time? And will there any issues between my company and the open source project? Because if I work for the open source project, then maybe it will bring some rules between the contract between me and my companies. So what's the suggestions, and how do you have any advice for us to balance the time and my life? Thanks.
So it's very true that working in open source can take a lot of time. And as a student or as someone working as an employee, you may not have that time. One of the key things, many of us who do open source contributions, a lot of our contributions are related to the work that we're doing. So as we've said, whether it's at League of Legends or Microsoft or many other places, often in your job you will end up working with open source software. And in the course of working with it, you very well may find a change that can be made, a bug that can be fixed, that will help you for your work. It's very tempting at that time to make that change and leave it there within your own company. The opportunity there is to then take that change and release it. You do have to work with your employer and whatever guidelines they have to make that happen. That is one of the challenges, and one of the reasons we do events like this is to help education on those parts. One suggestion I do have for students or for anyone else interested in getting open source, one of the best ways you can get started in a project is by contributing documentation. Many of us who are writing code don't spend as much time as we should writing documentation. So when you're learning a new project, right, maybe this is part of what you want to do for a research paper. You're learning how does Apache Spark work, or learning about how to do something with, now that we have .NET being released, right? When you're learning a new technology that's open source, take notes. Write up a documentation, write a tutorial, and share that tutorial back to the project. Almost every project, open source project, will love to have documentation provided to you. So it's an excellent way to get started. You don't need to know all the source code. You don't need to know how everything works. It's a great way to get started in an open source project.
Thanks.
And you also touched on your research. Traditionally, research papers get filed in universities and never be seen, except for other researchers later referencing those papers. And we see more and more that research gets pushed out as open source. And the challenge for the professor that heads that and the students that execute it is that it doesn't become as one thing off. It's that it has a continuum that goes through the generations of students that follow. So it's not just 1 year of students working on it, but that there is multiple years. So it keeps refilling itself and become a continuous project. That's quite important.
好，谢谢大家。Thanks for three keynotes, very exciting discussing, and thanks for Xiaohong for the panel host. And now it's the most exciting moment. That's a lucky draw. 现在抽奖时间，然后现在大家一定很饿。我们今天抽奖的是有午餐晚餐券，晚餐券的话会跟社区的大牛有机会共进晚餐，然后同时还有5份开源社大礼包。我们先从 Niclas Hedhman, you pick 2 tickets.
2 tickets.
Yes.
There is no tickets in here. First ticket, Lingu RE.
0521，请拿到这个号码的到我们的签到处领。